I'm going to go over some different selection tools, the most useful first, and then the less commonly used ones from there. So the newest of the selection tools, I think it's been around for a version or two, but it's the object selection tool, and it is pretty amazing. So I'll make sure I'm on the correct layer I want to select, and if I click and drag across, it does a really good job of just picking out the object that you're trying to select. And for some things, that's probably all you're going to need to do. But if you do have something with a lot of little fine details or wispy hairs, you're going to want to come up to this button here that's called Select and Mask. When you click on that, your viewport will probably look like this, which looks like nothing. So I tend to like to do overlay, but you can certainly try out some of these other options. But I like this one the best. It kind of makes it pretty clear what's not selected and what is. And then of course you can change the percentage to less or more. So the brush over here on the left, Refine Edge Brush Tool, it's only good for edges. So if you've got really big chunks of things, it's probably not going to do a good job. You're going to want to go back and fix it with some of the other tools we'll go over. On your keyboard, just so you know, next to the P key on your keyboard are your two brackets, and they make the brush grow or shrink. And then you just paint along the edges, and it kind of will get rid of things, and it will pick up the little hairs. So you can paint over areas where the sky is coming through, and paint over those wispy hairs that were not included. And you can just go over the edge as well. Kind of pick up a little bit of things that maybe shouldn't have been included. Okay. There is this little bit on the hooves, and that picks it up pretty well. Okay, so down where you should see output settings, and you might need to click on that little expand arrow, you can choose to decontaminate colors. And sometimes that does a good job. I can tell already I don't like that, so I'm going to turn that off. And then you have your output to options, so you can just output it to a selection. New layer, or sorry, a layer mask, new layer without. So there's a lot of different options. I tend to either use selection or layer mask, or sometimes a new layer with a layer mask. So I'm going to go ahead and say layer mask, and then say OK. So now it's cut everything away, but it's all still there. In case you're unfamiliar with masks, I will do a video more about those in the near future, but everything that is white is what's visible, and what is black is not visible. And you can actually paint with the paintbrush as long as you're on that mask part of the layer. If you paint with white, you will bring back details. If you paint with black, you will hide details. So that's the object select. So once again, object select, and I'm not on the correct layer. So object select is pretty great. One tool that I do like to show my students, though, Control D is deselect, is how you can use the magic wand tool. It's kind of one of the old tried and trues. Photoshop has had it forever. You have the tolerance, which is basically how picky is the magic wand going to be. So lower tolerance means, it will only select things that are exactly that color. The higher the tolerance, the more it'll kind of adjust and let in various shades and tints. So if you've got something with a very simple background, you can just click on that background and it'll select everything that's white very easily. And then I just go to the select menu and choose inverse, or Shift Control I. And then it flips my selection so that if I used my move tool right now you can see it does leave a tiny little bit behind, but it really does a good job of selecting something that's a little bit complicated, but that has such a plain, just flat white background. Makes it very easy. And then of course from there, if I wanted to, use my quick selection tool, I can hold down the Alt key. and it turns into a little minus, and I can subtract that little reflection part. And then if I use my move tool and move it one more time, you can see I left the reflection behind, and now I'm just left with the pineapple. And of course I can clean that up more if I choose to, but I'll just Control D and then leave that alone as it is. Honestly, the two you will use the most are just object selection and quick selection. Quick selection is good for things that are maybe just a little too complicated for object select to get them. So for example, if I use object select on this and I try to select this boy, it doesn't do a bad job actually. Like I said, object select is pretty great, but I believe it would be a little more difficult if I was trying to get somebody. Let's see, Photoshop is pretty smart these days. Yeah, I mean, look at that. Still, you can see there's little bits of him that got left behind, and object select is not going to grab those. So that's when I would switch to quick selection tool. And so you can just, zoom in, Alt scroll, and kind of click. Alt will subtract. Now you can see that selecting this kid is not going to be super easy no matter what I do. But I could get it close. Let's see, if you make your brush a little bit smaller, you should be able to be a little more refining on what you select. And then when you feel like you've got it pretty close, you can once again go up into Select and Mask and try out the Refine Edge. But nah, it's not really looking good. So this is a tricky one. So one thing that you can do, it's probably the most painstaking, oh, let's get rid of that, that part's easy, is turning on the mask select, or the quick mask. But when you turn it on, everything goes red, and then I can zoom in on areas where I've messed up, and you paint with black and white. Pressing X on your keyboard, so you can see you got your foreground color and your background color. So if you press X, it switches back and forth. So if I paint with white, probably want to set my brush hardness to 100%. Make sure everything's good there. And if I paint, I can bring back little details. This is kind of a more old school way of doing it, but it's good to know in case you are dealing with an object where those kind of shortcut tools just don't always work. So if I wanted to keep the backpack, or if I press X, I could paint with black and just, paint around it. And then once I kind of get those edges, I can make my brush a little bigger and don't have to be quite as careful on that. And then whenever you're, happy with the results, you just turn it off in the same place you turned it on. Okay, so that's how you can go back and make adjustments yourself. But there's always going to be areas. So even though I'm having a hard time with the ground and kind of keeping her shoe from becoming part of his leg, there's still the select and mask for things like the hair. So you'll notice select and mask is not there. So I have to go back to a selection tool, any selection tool, and then select and mask is there. And I can use that refined edge brush to at least get his hair a little bit better. Sometimes just picture selection is a big part of it though, because that's not working great. I probably chose the worst of them of all to try to do this with. But if I mask it, so this is just the mask for the layer, I can see how I did. Not great, but I can always get rid of or bring back. Okay. Now, one tool that I rarely use, but sometimes it is handy, is the magnetic lasso tool. And that one might work well for this kid. So let's see. So you click once, and then you kind of just drag along with your mouse. You can click to manually leave points, or as you drag your mouse, it will kind of snap. So if you're in an area where the contrast isn't good, and you're worried that, and it's kind of going to drift and not select what you want, you can just click to manually place points. Now, as you can see, this does take some time and some patience. You can use a space bar in the middle of using it to kind of move along. And if it messes up, I would just go to that quick mask where I can paint with black and white. So you just go along and do it as best I can. Kind of boring to watch, I'm sure. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe just do a sloppy finish. Come up to... You want to go all the way back to your original dot. Now, obviously, that's terrible. But the bottom half is good. And so if you're like, yeah, it's pretty good, but there's a few places where I messed up, that's where you would turn on your quick mask. And I can go back with my paintbrush and paint with black and white in any areas that I want to kind of correct. And turn it off. And it always just adjusts your selection. So that's the magnetic lasso tool. You ever mess up when you're using that? You know, you just screw up a lot. You know, well, you just Control D to deselect and start over. Or if it's all over the place, you just double click and it makes it a selection, and then you can Control D. Now, other thing I would like to point out, when you spend a lot of time on a selection, making it really, really good. So I'm going to go ahead and use the object select real quick. So object select, let's use it on this kid. Say I've just spent forever, I've touched it up, I've made it perfect. You don't want to have to come back and do this all over again because you're going to continue to use this selection. You can go up to the selection menu and you can say save selection. Call this, you know, boy in blue. And say okay. And then I Control D and I go and I do other things and close the file. It has to be a Photoshop file for this to save though. For you to be able to load a selection and come back to it, you have to be a Photoshop file, not a JPEG. But let's say I come back the next day, I can just go up to select, load selection, and find the boy in blue. Click OK, and it's back up. Okay. I think that's about all I have for selections. There are the regular lasso tools. Those ones are pretty simple though. They're just, you know, hand drawing it completely, you know, inaccurate. Only something you'd really use if you just needed to do a very rough selection of something. Same thing with the polygon. It's a good one if you were trying to select things that has a lot of straight lines. Like if I was trying to select a pillar, I could, you know, you could do it at different angles, but it's always going to be straight lines. And then you just have to go back to the original start point for it to close it. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful, and let me know if there's something else you'd like to learn more about in the comments.